I would like to have this presentation under the motto of how it is possible to keep COVID-19 under control in a democratic society with democratic means, and maybe even how it is possible to beat the virus. As you can see, Taiwan is this island right off the east coast of China. It is extremely densely populated. So there are 23 million people living on the island. And when the pandemic hit, when it became clear that it was a pandemic in early last year, because of the proximity to China and because of the close contacts to China, so there were lots of planes going back and forth every day, carrying businessmen, carrying tourists, and so on. So the general idea was that Taiwan would be the country that would be hardest hit by this new disease. But as I will show you, things turned out a little differently. But before we come to the COVID measures here in Taiwan, I want to show you this room, this little hotel room. This is where I spent 2 weeks recently. For 2 weeks, I was stuck in this room. It was my whole world, so to speak. And I was not allowed to leave it because I was doing the quarantine that everybody entering Taiwan has to go through. You can do it at home under certain conditions, but I had to do it in a hotel room. So I booked this place in a specially certified quarantine hotel. And they gave me this room and they told me that I'm not allowed to leave it for 2 weeks. And not leaving means actually not stepping 1 foot outside of the door. And then to drive home this point, in front of the door, they put this little shelf as a kind of psychological barrier here. So you could see, in case of a fire emergency, I would still have been able to get out, of course. But they really wanted to make clear to me, you stay inside. And also I knew that, and this is one of the steps, one of the policies here in Taiwan that are often portrayed a little bit critically in the Western, in the European media, for example. I knew that during those 14 days that I would be inside this room, my phone would be tracked. So I needed to have my phone turned on all the time, and the SIM card was located through cell towers. And if I had left my location where I was supposed to be, an alarm would have sounded and someone from the authorities would have gotten in touch with me and asked me what was going on. Also, every day, the Central Epidemic Command Center, CECC, sent me this text message asking about my conditions. I was also supposed to measure my body temperature to see if I'm developing a fever or not. And then, they basically wanted to know if I got any symptoms or not. And the first day also a very nice man from the Foreign Affairs Police called me and told me that if I have any questions, I can call them anytime. They want to take good care of me and so on. So it was a friendly way of dealing with me, but I knew full well that if I did not keep to the rules, that there would be consequences. And there were stories in the media about people who broke the quarantine, maybe only stepped in the hotel corridor for a few seconds, and they were fined like a few €1,000. So they were really strict about this. But still, I did this very willingly, and I did not feel that it was like an undue limitation of my freedom. First of all, because it affects everyone coming to Taiwan equally. So most people cannot even come to Taiwan anymore because they closed the borders for tourists. They closed the borders for most business visitors. So the largest number of people still coming to Taiwan right now are Taiwanese citizens and long-term residents like me with a residency permit. And all of us know that we need to do 14 days of quarantine. But we also know that after this, when it's over, and then we can enjoy the normal life again here in Taiwan. Because largely thanks to measures like this, Taiwan has been able to keep the virus out, almost completely out. And we know that we can have a life without lockdowns. We can go to shops. We can go to restaurants, we can even go to clubs and bars. There are concerts here and other large-scale events. So because everybody knows about this, they accept the necessity of keeping to this very strict quarantine regime here. So let's have a look at how good the numbers in Taiwan actually are. Okay, so the two numbers I want you to have a look at are these two, the red ones, confirmed cases and deaths. You see less than 900 confirmed cases and 7 deaths related to COVID-19. These are not the numbers from yesterday, these are the numbers for the whole pandemic, ever since they started counting early last year. And there are good reasons to believe that these numbers are true. So you can imagine that people living in Taiwan are very happy about this situation, and they really want to do their part in keeping it like this. If we talk about how was this possible, how did Taiwan achieve this, I think the most important reason, the single most important reason, was that Taiwan was prepared for a case exactly like this to happen. And when they got wind of the first reports coming out of Wuhan, they reacted immediately, extremely early. They put in place their emergency measures and they just followed through on these plans that they had prepared. So the reason for this good preparation is that back in 2003, when the first SARS pandemic hit, Taiwan was the country that was second worst affected right after China. I think at that time we had 73 deaths related to SARS-1, so to speak, here in Taiwan. And at that time, the health authorities were not that well prepared, and people were very unhappy about the inadequate government response. And so Taiwanese said, we are not going to let this happen again. And they redrew their emergency response plans. They reorganized their health emergency response system, and they made sure that the next time a pandemic situation happens, they would be better prepared. And this really paid off now. We also need to keep in mind that because of the political pressure from China, Taiwan is internationally mostly isolated. So they cannot join a lot of the international organizations, a lot of the UN organizations, or any for that matter. For example, the World Health Organization. Taiwan cannot be a World Health Organization member, so they are not a part of that information sharing network. So they are really left to themselves to look after themselves. Also, you can add to that a healthy distrust of anything coming out of China. And so when on December 31st, 2019, the Taiwanese authorities got the first news from the city of Wuhan, where a doctor called Li Wenliang was sharing information about an unknown disease. Well, they still suspected it to be SARS-1, making the rounds there. Taiwan was immediately alarmed, and they reacted on that very day, on December 31st, 2019. So here's a newspaper report from the next day, January 1st, 2020. The Central Disease Control Center started to check flights from Wuhan. Yesterday, the rumor spread online. And starting on that day, the CDC announced that all flights coming into Taiwan from Wuhan would be boarded by officials and inspected before passengers were allowed to leave the aircraft. So they started by checking the health condition of everyone arriving from Wuhan on December 31st, 2019. And if you had fever or any other suspicious symptoms, then they would take you for further inspection, because back then, of course, you still did not know about COVID-19. You did not know it was a special disease. You had no way of testing for it. But this way, they wanted to stay on top of it as soon as they knew something was happening here. Also, coming back to this time, now we talk about January. In the month of January, people in Taiwan were pretty much preoccupied with something else, because on January 11, 2020, we had a presidential and parliament election here. So the whole country, of course, was talking about the political situation. People were going to the polls, and people were going to large-scale rallies. So back then, no one really talked about this news that I just showed you. It was just, it went largely unnoticed by the general population. And we were not aware that the health authorities were already trying to find out more about this situation. Only the moment that Chinese government decided to lock down the city of Wuhan, of course, that was when the realization came to everyone here that something big was happening here. And we also quickly got the impression that the authorities were already trying to get this situation under control. Because also a few weeks later, I think it was in February, we had the first local cases here. You had a way to do testing then and to find out if someone is infected or not. And we had a few local cases here, and immediately the health authorities tried to get the local spread under control. So they isolated the people who were infected, of course, and all the contact persons, and they tried to break the infection chains locally. And then it became clear pretty quickly that they were successful with that. And after that, the next steps were to restrict the inbound travel to Taiwan step by step. So first of all, flights from Wuhan were stopped. Then all flights and tour groups from China were stopped. And then come March, Taiwan basically restricted the inbound travel from Europe, from the US, and from the rest of the world, just as the numbers started to explode over there. And since then, it's fair to say that Taiwan has been able to keep itself virtually virus-free. So these 900 cases you'll see there, and the statistics, only about 20 or 30 of them were local cases where the infection happened in Taiwan, not in a controlled environment, but out in the society. And all the other 800 and more cases were people who came in and who were detected while they were in quarantine. So everything since then, for more than a year now, is about keeping the virus out of Taiwan, making sure it does not start to spread uncontrolled here. And the upside to that is that Taiwan never had a second wave of the virus. Taiwan never had a first wave of the virus. Taiwan did not have to have lockdowns, and life could go on as normal here. So, and all of this was possible in a democratic system and with democratic means. So right here we see the health minister of Taiwan giving his press briefings. He has been doing these press briefings pretty much daily for more than a year now. Every day he sits down, him and the other health officials, they talk to the press, they keep everyone abreast of the latest developments, and also explain the government measures. So when they introduce something like the quarantine system or fines for someone breaking the rules, they will explain to everybody why this is necessary. So it was really all about the government trying to get the trust of the people, trust of the population. So not just top-down measures, and this is what you need to do now, but this is only possible because most of the people are convinced that this is the best way to go. And this is trust that has to be earned time and again. And I will talk about the current minor outbreak in Taiwan of community infections. And right now, the government again needs to convince everyone that their measures are still the best and this is still the way to go. So right now, from Taiwan's perspective, the rest of the world is one big high-risk area, maybe with the exception of a few countries like New Zealand. So all the inbound travel right now is viewed skeptically, and no one would question the quarantine system, for example. So of course you could say that, well, what about the economy? Maybe the corporations are not so happy. Maybe the business travel has also been largely stopped by this. Well, from an economic point of view, Taiwan also came out one of the winners from this pandemic so far. So you can see that in 2020, Taiwan actually experienced economic growth of more than 2%, one of the very, very few countries to have economic growth in last year. One of the reasons for this is that Taiwan has a very export-reliant economy, and the most important sector for Taiwan is technology. So just as the rest of the world needed to move to work from home, and video conferences needed webcams, internet routers, new laptops, and so on, this of course was a boost for the Taiwanese companies making just this stuff. So also from an economic point of view, Taiwan cannot complain really about how things went. Foreign tourism, of course, was largely stopped, or is totally stopped right now, but tourism was not that important for Taiwan to begin with. And also the domestic tourism, of course, got a huge shot in the arm now, because everyone, well, people still want to go on vacation. They cannot leave the country because it's not safe anywhere else. And when they come back, they need to go into quarantine. So people are now vacationing in Taiwan, and a lot of the domestic travel hotspots are also booked out all the time. So now I talk to you about some recent developments, and that that the authorities cannot let their guard down, even if it looks so good. They know that in a matter of a few days or a few weeks, if something goes wrong, the situation can change drastically. And so right now, I show you the graphic about a case of local infection that happened, I think, 2 weeks ago. A doctor in a hospital, case number 838, got infected probably by one of the patients that he was attending to. So one of the people who got tested positive in quarantine, landed in the hospital. The doctor was treating him, and somehow the doctor got infected, and he spread the virus to a few other doctors, to some nurses in the hospital, and they again spread it to family members. And this is the biggest hotspot in Taiwan right now that the authorities are really trying to get a hold of. So right now, I think they told between 300 and 500 people to go into a quarantine, and the whole hospital has been sealed off. Any patient that is released from the hospital, no matter what he was treated for, also needs to go into a quarantine. So they are working really hard to contain this current cluster. And you can also see this level of detail and contact tracing, of course, is only possible if the authorities are not overwhelmed by the number of cases, if you can really trace each and every chain of contact. One of the steps that happened after this cluster was identified was that some large-scale events, public events that were planned here, were cancelled. For example, in a week or so, there was supposed to be a big international book fair in Taipei, where a lot of authors and writers from abroad and publishing company representatives would have come here, and there would have been tens of thousands of visitors. And Taiwan was really looking forward to this, because it would of course have been a big PR success for them to be hosting the only big book fair this year. But as a cautionary measures, after this hospital cluster happened, the book fair was cancelled right now. So in closing, I would like to point out that in the Western media, of course I'm following the German reporting as well, there are often some clichés going around, and some views of, well, the people in East Asia, it's very generalizing, of course. The people in East Asia listen to authorities, and there is no individualism in these countries. And then they talk about China, they talk about Vietnam, and they throw Taiwan and South Korea in there. There's no differentiation between the different countries and different cultures. But I think this is just not true. This is just a cliche that still, at least in Europe and in the US, I know it's still around. And actually, the reason why it's working here, and the reason why the people are willing to go along, is the understanding that in times of a pandemic, what's good for everyone is also good for me personally. It also protects me and my family. And so this is why people think it's everyone's responsibility to do their part in this, to keep to the rules that they are convinced make sense. and there is less tolerance here of the kind of egoistic behavior that's just harmful to others. So, of course, in the end, the question is, this has been going on for more than a year now in Taiwan. How much longer can they keep it up? How much longer can Taiwan basically shut itself off from the world and make it really hard for those who still want to come here? What is the exit scenario for Taiwan? For example, there is no vaccination program in Taiwan as of right now. They do not want to use the Chinese vaccine, so they are also hoping for the ones from Pfizer, Moderna, etc. And they are also trying to develop their own vaccine. But as of now, that has not happened. So this is not the way out for Taiwan. Right now, most people here are still convinced that they are still on the right path here. They are satisfied that they can live safely without risk of infection and lead their normal lives here. I mean, I can go out, I can go to restaurants, shops, bars, whatever I want to. And the restrictions that I talked about are deemed to be an acceptable cost for defending this excellent record of fighting COVID so far. Well, to be honest, back in February, March, April, I was also here in Taiwan, and back then I was not too impressed by the German response because I had the impression that they were just not prepared. They basically squandered the whole month of February when they still had time to prepare before it really hit. And then in March, they needed to move into the lockdown. And then, okay, the result of the first lockdown in spring in Germany was less bad than a lot of other places. So, well, I thought maybe they can get around. And then in summer, of course, it looked okay. But then again, it just became obvious that the German authorities did not use the time they had in summer to adequately prepare for a second bigger wave coming up. So I was really disillusioned again. And from the perspective of someone living in Taiwan, of course, we can see that the situation, let's say, in Great Britain is worse than in Germany. But this is not so much of a qualitative difference. For us here, the situation in all of Europe is just a huge problem. And for me, as a German, looking at the way the German government tried to handle this, it was really disillusioning because you know this idea of the Germans being able to plan ahead, to have a long-term strategy, to make rational choices, and so on. And this whole idea was really pulverized by the events of the pandemic, in my eyes at least.